following is a conversation I had with Dr. Eric Trexler. Dr. Trexler is an active researcher and coach. He is also the co-owner of Stronger by Science, Mass Research Review, and the MacroFactor AI coaching app. In this conversation, we talk about how Dr. Trexler got into research and bodybuilding, the efficacy of various supplements, including beetroot, metabolic adaptation and metabolic phenotypes, and the future of research in bodybuilding. If you like the podcast, please feel free to leave a review on your favorite listening service. If you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and comment if you have any suggestions for questions on future episodes or future guests. I hope you enjoy listening to the podcast just as much as I enjoy conducting these interviews. Thanks for listening. I wanted to start and just ask how you got into all of this stuff.
Yeah, so growing up, I was really into football, American football, if you've got a lot of international listeners. And I'm short. I'm not tall at all. I'm like maybe 5'7" on a tall day. So it was really clear to me when I was really young, if you want to get on the field and see meaningful playing time, you're going to have to find an advantage. And so I would do a lot of training to try to say, okay, I'm not going to be the biggest, but if I could be the fastest and the strongest and really technically skilled, maybe that's going to be a viable avenue for me. So I got into resistance training because I was trying to do better at football. And I fell in love with training and started to like it even more than the sport I was training for. And then, I'm walking around the hallway at school, like at that time, like 5'5", kind of little tiny ball of muscle, pretty lean. And the wrestling coaches were like, dude, you have to wrestle. Like, even if you suck, just you look like a wrestler. So now you're a wrestler. And that got me really into nutrition, going through weight cutting and understanding how nutritional inputs, start to really impact performance and physique related outcomes. So, yeah, by the time I was 16, I knew I wanted to be in, sport nutrition, training, performance, something like that. Loved wrestling, but honestly just wasn't that good. And so between not being that good and having a lot of concussions, it was clear that I needed to find a different way to scratch that competitive itch and to stay connected to training and nutrition. And so when I was in college studying exercise science, I got into natural bodybuilding and powerlifting, and, not necessarily great at either, but good enough to kind of stay interested in it. While I was at Ohio State doing my undergrad, I got involved in some research, really just because they made me. I was in like the honors program, and they said, well, if you want to graduate with honors, you have to do an undergrad research project. And I'm glad that they had that requirement. At the time, I thought it was, kind of a huge pain in the ass, but I fell in love with it. And so then I was planning to become a physical therapist, which would have been a terrific career. It's great work that physical therapists do, but I fell in love with research, and I was like, I want to keep doing this for the foreseeable future. So did a master's, did a PhD, and was really fortunate that I was in a lab where I could study what I loved. So of course, there were some projects I had to do them because it was what we were doing, I didn't have like full autonomy, but, I got a chance to do some really cool projects that were highly relevant to bodybuilders and powerlifters. And some of those studies were actually in bodybuilders, which is pretty atypical. It's very hard to recruit and study bodybuilders in an academic setting. So I guess the moral of the story is I've started lifting when I was 12, fell in love with it, and got really, really lucky about 100 different times. People gave me opportunities I didn't deserve. Stuff worked out that shouldn't have. And ultimately, I'm here doing a bunch of really cool stuff that I love doing. And I think the moral of the story is I love lifting, and I'm really just full of gratitude because it's worked out pretty well to get me to a point where I can do what I love for a living, which is great.
Yeah, that's really huge, and I think those are some values that I share as well. Is just being grateful for the opportunities that have been presented, but also being grateful for the opportunity that I've been able to do the things that I love for a living, and that's really cool that we share those things, and it's really cool that you've been able to and have been presented those opportunities, whether it be luck, like you mentioned, but it is really awesome. What I was going to ask you about was your research. So you had done some research in, I believe, supplements when you were getting your PhD, correct? Would you mind touching on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I did my PhD in a lab that was really, really active in the supplement space. Um, my dissertation, like my main focal point with supplementation, was on citrulline malate and beetroot juice, which is a source of dietary nitrate. So I was really interested in that because, I mean, when again, kind of coming back to the ability to do what I really love and what really interests me, when I first got into lifting, nitric oxide boosters were kind of just becoming a huge thing. Like that was when NO Explode was just getting really popular, and people were like, "Man, there's this new thing. It's called arginine, and life is never going to be the same." And so it was really cool to be able to go back and kind of study some of the pre-workout ingredients that really were part of my process of falling in love with lifting, to be honest. Um, and so yeah, I mean, we did research on citrulline and beetroot juice. We did research on caffeine supplementation, creatine supplementation, and then just a huge mix of other things: pomegranate extract, cordyceps. We did some different like high molecular weight carbohydrate research, some protein research. I mean, we
Oh, wow.
we really hit a really broad spectrum of supplementation, but I would say my focal points were creatine, caffeine, citrulline, and beetroot.
Okay. And as far as I understand, those supplements have been shown to have some efficacy, right? Those are have some performance enhancing benefits, right?
Yeah, to varying degrees. All four
Right.
supplements have to kind of be, separated out and kind of judged on their own. But
Yeah.
creatine, absolutely gold standard when it comes
Hmm.
to supplements for strength athletes. Caffeine, pretty good. It's no creatine, but it's a pretty reliable, pretty proven ingredient. Citrulline malate, it's an interesting one. The first few papers that came out were very positive, and that is a phenomenon that is somewhat common in research, is that the first few papers on anything, you tend to see more positive findings and some of the larger effect sizes that you're ever going to see in that
Hmm.
research. And then a lot of times interventions will kind of come down to earth as people start to study them more and publish more work. So with citrulline, the first few papers were very, very positive, and then there was this wave of papers that kind of reported neutral effects. And so people, humans, we work. Our brain likes to tell stories, and we like to tell narratives that have a temporal component. So a lot of people kind of internalize that as we used to think citrulline worked, but then these new studies came out and clearly it doesn't. But of course, that's not the way we want to view it. Research doesn't really have that temporal component. One of the projects in my PhD was a meta-analysis where we combined all of the published research to date and did a quantitative analysis of that pooled data. And what we found was a small to trivial effect size, but nonetheless a statistically significant positive effect with citrulline when it came to strength and power outcomes. So it's kind of, in terms of the size of the effect, it's more of a caffeine than it is a creatine for sure.
Hmm.
And then beetroot juice is very, very promising. There's not quite as many studies in the resistance training area. It's more studied for endurance related outcomes, and the data in that area are quite positive. But there's also some emerging data indicating that beetroot juice and other sources of dietary nitrate are quite helpful with resistance training performance as well. So it's there's less data, but it looks to be quite equivalent or quite similar to citrulline malate if I were to kind of extrapolate into the future. I expect that we're going to see that those are quite similar in terms of their magnitude of effect.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think I was using beetroot for a while because I had heard about those effects, and then also blood pressure was another thing that I heard might have some benefits as well. And I think that might be some of the reason why it
Mhm.
helps with some of these endurance outcomes and things like that as well. I was going
Yeah,
to ask
yeah.
you.
So,
Oh, good.
oh, I was
Sorry to
going to
interrupt
say,
you.
yeah, the main, when we talk about beetroot juice, we're talking about nitric oxide production. We're talking about pretty notable effects on endothelial function, on regulating the vasculature, vasodilation, and so yeah, the effects on blood pressure are very reliable, very straightforward. And, you can, if you look at a group of folks who are hypertensive and you do an intervention with a high enough dose, it's very, very common with beetroot to see a reduction in blood pressure.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really big, because I feel like hypertension, I mean, maybe not as much in the resistance training community. Enhanced side, you probably see that a little bit more, but that is something that can be an issue for people. So that is kind of a dual benefit of that supplement. I wanted to ask you if there were any other notable dietary supplements that were worth taking. Anything that you've come across that is worth the money.
Let's see. I mean, worth the money is a very subjective thing that ultimately
Yes.
comes down to the individual. I mean, it's a fair question, but I always like to mention that because I used to, like, when I was first making supplement content outside of the research world, when I was making articles and podcasts and stuff, that is the question I would try to answer. Is it worth it? And
Mhm.
I eventually stopped doing that because I noticed that to even answer that question, you have to say, well, worth it to who? What's on the line?
Right.
What's at stake? And what I try to do now is I try to describe, for a person in this situation with this type of outcome of interest, what effect size could they reliably expect to see? And then you take that information, you combine it with the cost of the supplement, and that's where you start to get an idea of, is it worth it to me for the type
Mhm.
of exercise I do and for what I have on the line, what I have at stake. So, for example, for most lifters, um, beetroot juice is an excellent supplement, but one of the issues there is that a lot of the products are really low quality. The actual nitrate content of a lot of products on the market is really, really variable. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about massive, massive variation in the actual nitrate content. And so for a lot of folks, I say, well, if you're going to use a beetroot product, like, here's a couple that seem to be pretty good, but they tend to be pretty expensive. And so if you're like a recreational lifter, no blood pressure issues, and you're just trying to get an extra couple reps in your workout, you can have some interesting debates about how much those couple extra reps matter for hypertrophy. That's the first part of the conversation, and then second of all, are they worth $2.50 a workout? And so you start to get into scenarios where you'd say, does this supplement work? Yes. Is it worth it? Only to a select few of people who really are willing to shell out some money for two more reps on their last set of bench press. When it comes to the ones that are worth it to me, for someone who doesn't have a lot on the line, who doesn't have like really high stakes with their training, I think creatine does well, and is quite affordable when there aren't like crazy supply chain shortages going on.
Yeah.
Historically, it's been affordable, but the price has been really up and down with over the last couple years. Caffeine is great, and it's like super cheap, but I usually don't even get it as a supplement. I just drink a lot of coffee, and that works just fine.
Mhm.
Uh, Citrulline malate tends to be pretty affordable. And the nice thing about it is it's not hard to take. It's not like beta alanine where you have to take, 1.5 or 2 grams at a time, several times throughout the day. Like citrulline malate, you mix it in water. It actually tastes very good on its own if you just mix it with like something sweet. So like
Mhm.
there's like little like Mio water
Oh yeah.
enhancers. Citrulline malate naturally has like a nice sour flavor to it. So if you mix it with like a blue raspberry flavored water, you have this like sour blue raspberry that is absolutely incredible. So I actually, Greg Schiltz is the dietitian for Stronger by Science on our coaching team.
Uh-huh.
He's one of our two dietitians. He mentioned to me that he just drinks citrulline malate because he likes it. Like, he's like, yeah, maybe it'll help with my training. Who knows? But it's affordable and it tastes terrific if it's
Yeah.
mixed with something sweet.
Uh-huh.
So citrulline malate and creatine, I think, are affordable and for a lot of lifters, kind of worth it. Caffeine is in the same boat. And that's kind of my short list of things that kind of meet that combination of pretty reliable for performance and also tend to be quite affordable. And then
Okay.
for people who are really doing specific, like, if you're like a CrossFitter or you do a lot of strongman medleys, I think maybe for them, beta alanine might start to make sense, but for your typical bodybuilder, as more and more studies come out, I'm actually leaning further and further away from beta alanine. I'm just increasingly less convinced that a typical bodybuilding program actually taxes the glycolytic energy system to a sufficient enough magnitude that beta alanine would be critically important. It looks like you really have to do stuff that really ramps up, that glycolytic system. You really start to accumulate those extra protons. Local pH really starts to dive. Outside of those contexts, for the typical lifter who's doing a set of 12, I'm just not sure if we're really physiologically in a position where beta alanine is getting an opportunity to shine. And yeah, like I said with beetroot, it's a nice supplement, but the really high quality ones tend to be relatively pricey. So for a lot of the people I work with, it works, but it's usually not worth it.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I framed that question like that. I think it is kind of an individual cost benefit that needs to occur based on the effect, and then affordability and the various other factors as well. I was going to ask. You mentioned that beetroot. It's hard to get the proper dosing. Have you looked into any of the supplements on the market, and them not having the proper ingredients in it? Like I know some of the fish oils, and maybe I'm incorrect on this, but some of the fish oils on the market may be oxidized and may not be of great quality. Is that something that we see across the supplements being sold, like something you get on Amazon? And is that something you've even looked into?
Oh yeah, I've looked into it a lot.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, so you are correct about fish oil. Oxidation is a common issue. So when you're buying fish oil, you have to be pretty particular about how is it packaged. Is this a company that's cutting corners when it comes to the manufacturing and distribution? When it comes to beetroot, it's very common and appealing to kind of be really harsh on supplement companies, and they've earned it. They deserve that. Like there have been enough companies cutting enough corners that the negative reputation is, broadly speaking, deserved. But I do have I give them a pass a little bit with nitrate when it comes to like beetroot extracts and their nitrate content, because that's what we're looking for. Is, do you have the amount of nitrate I'm looking for? That's why we're taking beetroot juice in almost all cases. And what's really interesting about nitrate content of vegetables is that it depends on a lot. And so there was a study, it's been too many years. I don't know the author names, but there was a study where, supplements aside, they were just looking at conventional produce, and they were just taking nitrate rich vegetables off the shelf at grocery stores across the United States. They were taking them from I think Boston, Dallas, Los Angeles. They took them for 5 different regions, and they tested the nitrate content of the vegetables. And it was wildly different from place to place, because the nitrate content depends on the soil quality, how it was grown, how it was shipped and stored, how long it's been on the shelves. So even with conventional produce, it's very difficult to standardize nitrate content. And that just gets even worse when you work further down the chain and you get into the extracts and the powders. So when I was working on my dissertation research and planning it, one of my challenges was I need to find an actual product here that's reliable enough that I can use it for the study. At that time, there was a product called Beet Sport, which is like a high nitrate shot. It comes ready to drink as a little, a 2-ounce shot. And it has 400 milligrams of nitrate per serving. It has reliably done quite well when it comes to third-party testing for nitrate content. I've never made a dime from that company, never will, as far as I know, unless they want to send me some money. But yeah, I don't have any relationship with them, but that's the product I used for my dissertation research because it had a good track record of third-party testing. And to the best of my knowledge, it still seems to be kind of the go-to product in terms of just reliability of actually having the listed nitrate dose. And like I said, I wouldn't be shocked if some of the people making these products are underdosing the nitrate just because the raw materials they're getting just have they have quite variable nitrate content before they even go into the manufacturing process.
Yeah. And so is there a way to ensure like you sourced that Beat It product, knowing that it had a good nitrate content? Is there a way like for the consumer to be able to find out if these products are dosed correctly, like maybe looking for products with third-party testing or something like that? Is there a reliable way to do that?
Well, that's tricky because with third-party testing, there are different types of third-party testing. So, you might see a label on a supplement that says, hey, this is third-party tested. But if you look into the details of the third-party testing program, sometimes all that means some third party somebody to go audit the manufacturing facility, and they just walked around and they said, yep, I don't see
Good
any
job.
rat poop. It looks like you have all your documents and binders over there, you're good to go. And so sometimes that's all the third party certification means. Sometimes it's, hey, we tested it for banned substances and we can say that this product doesn't contain banned substances. Does it actually contain what's on the label? I don't know. I can just tell you it doesn't have any banned substances. There are some kind of higher tier third party testing services that do go and actually test label claims, but I'm not sure of any that test specifically for nitrate content. So like they might dig around in the manufacturing process and figure out, did you actually use 1200 milligrams of the beetroot extract powder that you say you used in this formulation? I'm not certain if there are any that take an extra step and say, I don't care if you got 1200 milligrams of that powder and it was standard to X% nitrate. We're going to actually test the nitrate. I'm really not certain if that exists. It very well could, but I'm
Mhm.
not sure.
Cool. Yeah, I was just kind of curious on that, as far as like consumers being able to source these products. So I wanted to get a little bit into something I think I've seen you talk a little bit about, and something that I was becoming, I don't want to say concerned, but I definitely would. To give background, I did my own contest prep this last year, and as I was, making adjustments, and even beforehand, I was looking into metabolic adaptation. It was just something that it becomes very relevant when you are in a deficit, and more so for more people. But I'll have you talk about that a little bit. But I was just curious, if you could kind of introduce the concept of metabolic adaptation, and there's a couple things like thrifty and spendthrift. Those terms I think I first heard you say them. If you could define those terms too, because I find them very interesting.
Sure. Well, first and most importantly, how did your contest prep go?
Oh, well. I ended up winning my local show and qualifying for nationals. Then I went to the USA's and I placed 8th there.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Oh,
I think my internet's being a little bit spotty.
it
It
could be
sounds
mine
like
as
you
well.
said you won a local show, qualified for nationals, and got eighth.
Got 8th at the USA's, yeah, in Vegas.
That's awesome, man. Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I would I've done one pro show as a
Mhm.
natural, got absolutely stomped. And the idea of stepping on a national stage is absolutely horrifying. So to stand up there and get eighth is really, really impressive.
I
So
appreciate that.
very, very glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Now, metabolic adaptation, since you asked. It's, the reason I got into studying it is because I was actually coming right out of a prep when I started grad school. And I was like, hey, that sucked. I feel like shit. I'd love to learn why, and so that was really what got me into studying this stuff. And I've been doing it since like 2013, approximately. So metabolic adaptation, anyone who's competed or got dieted down to like a kind of photo shoot ready or stage ready physique, you're going to hear this stuff and say, oh, okay. So basically what happens is we start dieting and our body has no interest getting down to like 4% body fat or wherever we're trying to get for bodybuilding, 4, 5, 6%, whatever the case may be. And our body fortunately for the survival of our species, it is quite resilient when it comes to underfeeding, and there are some adaptive processes that take place. So it's not that we can be immune to starvation. That's obviously not the case, but our body has some levers it can pull to try to slow that process down. All right. So if you are starving in a famine, that's great news. If you're prepping for a bodybuilding show, that's just more friction. It's just, the process is getting a little bit harder when you're trying to get down to super low body fat. And really what's happening is there's two stimuli that are kind of contributing to metabolic adaptation. One is being in a calorie deficit. The other is losing fat mass over time and getting down to really low body fat levels. And what happens is in both of those contexts, we have reductions in a circulating hormone called leptin. Leptin feeds into the hypothalamus, which is a structure in the brain. And the hypothalamus kind of integrates signals about energy intake, energy expenditure, energy availability. The hypothalamus is integrating all of that information, and leptin is a key signal telling the hypothalamus how much energy there is to go around. So when we're prepping for a show, the hypothalamus gets the signal that leptin is very, very low. And it says, okay, that's not great, but let's see what we can do here to try to ease this process a little bit. So the hypothalamus is going to, have many downstream effects. Usually when we're in this situation, and we're going to broadly define this, it's almost like a syndrome, like a collection of effects that we'll call metabolic adaptation. It's dictated by the hypothalamus when energy availability, both short-term and long-term, is quite low. And we're going to see things like reduced energy expenditure, both the resting component and the non-exercise activity component of energy expenditure. Those are going to go down. We'll also see effects in a lot of different hormone cascades. So a lot of them actually start at the hypothalamus, and then there's, 2 or 3 different structures that ultimately are involved in the production of a hormone. So the hypothalamus is, for a lot of these hormone cascades, the kind of first stop when it comes to determining how much hormone to make. So we're going to see downstream effects like reduced thyroid hormone, reduced testosterone, reduced sex hormones in females as well, which often is observed in the form of the loss or the dysregulation of the menstrual cycle, a very, very common thing among female physique athletes. So all this stuff kind of wrapped up together is what we broadly could call metabolic adaptation. It's this reduction in energy expenditure and these hormonal effects that impact, sex hormones, thyroid hormone, and I should also mention hunger and satiety hormones as well. So when you're at the end of a diet and you say, for especially for like a natural athlete who doesn't have any exogenous hormones coming in, you start to notice, okay, clearly I have low testosterone. Clearly my thyroid hormone is low. I'm always freezing no matter how hot it is outside. Even just funny things when I was working in the lab, when I prepped and did my pro debut, and I got very, very, very lean for the show. I did poorly because I just didn't have enough muscle, but I got very lean for the show. I was happy with the shape I got in, but people started to notice that even my posture at work was changing. Like I wouldn't sit up as straight in my chair, and I certainly wouldn't fidget anymore. And that's because the body is really kind of making these completely subconscious adjustments to attenuate energy expenditure so that we're just trying to stop what appears to the hypothalamus as starvation. And so you mentioned the idea of thrifty and spendthrift, and those are terms that refer to metabolic phenotypes. So it's kind of just like a cluster of physical characteristics that we can group together. So there's these 2 different opposing metabolic phenotypes. And what these phenotypes describe is basically how your body responds to overfeeding and underfeeding. So someone who is thrifty, that's a term that some people might recognize from completely different contexts. Usually people that are thrifty, they do a lot of saving. They're quite like financially thrifty is someone who really saves a lot of money and doesn't overspend too much, right? And so that's kind of the same thing with metabolic phenotypes. A thrifty phenotype, someone who has a thrifty phenotype, when they start dieting, their body ramps up metabolic adaptation quite quite substantially, because what they're trying to do is save as much energy as they can since there's not much to go around. Now, someone with a thrifty phenotype also saves a lot of energy on the other side of the coin. So if you overfeed someone and put someone with a thrifty metabolic phenotype in a huge energy surplus, they're going to store fat quite easily and quite efficiently. Now, the opposite of that is someone with a spendthrift phenotype. Now, these folks, in bodybuilding terms, we could say that they're lucky, right? Because when they start dieting, they don't experience as much metabolic adaptation. So what that means is their energy expenditure is not going to drop as much when they're dieting down to a low body fat. So on one side, someone with a spendthrift phenotype, you might look at them and say, you're so lucky, you have less friction when you're en route to getting really shredded. And that's true. But there is potentially a downside, which is that spendthrift people with a spendthrift phenotype, when they overfeed, they often find it very challenging to gain weight intentionally, and that is a big part of building is part of bodybuilding. In the natural bodybuilding world, sometimes we get so fixated on getting really, really lean that we forget that. But it can be challenging. Someone with a spendthrift phenotype, we've seen studies where they do very controlled overfeeding studies in the laboratory. And so they know that these people are in a huge caloric surplus. And what happens is people with a spendthrift phenotype, they burn through the extra calories. So just as the hypothalamus can dictate these reductions in expenditure, it can also ramp up increases in energy expenditure that kind of burn off the caloric surplus. And so, you'll see studies where they take in a huge group of people, everyone gets overfed the same amount, and they're just feeding them a ton of extra calories. Some people gain several kilograms of fat, other people barely gain a pound, and their energy expenditure is through the roof. So that is the concept of metabolic phenotypes. And the last thing I'll mention there is that I presented them as a dichotomy, but it's really a spectrum, which means there are some people with a kind of thrifty metabolic phenotype or an extremely thrifty or kind of spendthrift or extremely spendthrift. And most people tend to fall in the middle, which is what we typically see with any kind of biological characteristic that falls on a spectrum. Most people, by definition, are pretty average, and that also applies to metabolic phenotypes.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. What are some things? So I know you mentioned the hypothalamus is sending out these signals and causing these adaptations. What are some things that happens? Like, for example, you said a spendthrift phenotype. Sorry, I'm forgetting that they will. It'll be hard for them to maybe gain weight. They'll have these compensations in expenditure. What are some of those compensations like? I know fidgeting might be one of them, but maybe some other things.
Yeah, I mean, usually what we see is just a robust increase in resting energy expenditure and a robust increase in non-exercise activity. So, like you said, just more fidgeting. People who just kind of have a subconscious tendency to pace around the room rather than sitting stationary. So the same way that someone with a thrifty phenotype, when they're dieting, I mean, you've probably seen this, if not felt it, when I'm prepping for a show, if I walk past my mailbox and I remember I didn't check the mail, I'm like, how bad could it be? No one needs me that bad. I'll check it in a week, whatever. But people that have kind of a spendthrift phenotype, there is a resting component where there's just kind of an intrinsic upregulation of energy expenditure, but there's also some of those kind of subconscious non-exercise activity alterations where they're fidgeting more, their posture is more active in the chair if they're sitting down, and they kind of just bounce around the room a little bit, to be honest. So it's really fascinating to see how the hypothalamus can integrate that information and make these adjustments in accordance with an individual's metabolic phenotype.
Yeah, so the NEAT is one of the major contributors, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so then I know that I've heard some other things like, and this is probably happens for either, but you have less body mass, which I mean probably still contributes to NEAT, but you also have less organ mass, a few other things that might happen when you're that deep into a diet.
Absolutely. Yeah, the organ mass thing, there's been some really nuanced, very sophisticated analyses in the last few years that have kind of clarified the impact of organ mass because uh, it's quite true that some of the earlier papers quantifying metabolic adaptation probably have overstated the degree of true adaptation. Like you said, when someone loses body mass, that's a smaller person. They should not be burning as many calories throughout the day, right? So that's not adaptive. That's just part of being a smaller person. What we're interested in with metabolic adaptation is how much extra down regulation and energy expenditure is happening that we cannot explain based on changes in body mass. And that's where the organ mass thing comes into play is, people in the fitness world talk about, oh, you should, lift weights to build muscle because it burns more calories at rest. That's true. That's not a false statement. Sometimes it's overstated in terms of magnitude, but it's not a false statement. But what's really fascinating is people talk about muscle as if it's this energy burning metabolic machine at rest. And it's like, dude, have you heard of kidneys? I mean, kidneys, liver, heart, brain, they are absolutely tearing through energy at rest at a level that totally overshadows muscle. And so, yeah, those organs, especially when there's a considerable amount of weight loss happening or a person is getting very, very, very lean, those organs do get smaller. There's a reduction in organ tissue as well. And there have been, like I said, very sophisticated analyses that say, hey, when we account for that, it's not that metabolic adaptation disappears, but the estimate gets smaller because a lot of the early papers would just count fat-free mass as if it's one thing. And for a lot, it makes sense to do that because unless you have, essentially MRI or like really high quality imaging where you could go through organ by organ, it's usually not that practical to actually quantify the change in organ size. So it's kind of a question of methodology and quantification that makes it kind of like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't fault the early researchers for just normalizing to total fat-free mass because in most contexts, it's just not going to be feasible to say, well, let's just go ahead and measure the volume or mass of every single organ in the body. And it's going to be very, very time and labor and resource intensive to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's still something that can be a challenge in research, is just having measurement tools that can accurately assess these things. I think there are some measurement tools, as far as I know, I'm not a researcher, but as far as I've seen, some of these measurement tools can have some of that noise, and it can be difficult to differentiate or sort out some of that noise by these measurement tools. And as time goes on, they get better and whatnot. But like, for example, like a DEXA scan practically is one of the better measures, I guess, but it still has a certain amount of error associated with it, if I'm using the correct terminology.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I got a DEXA scan done during one of my preps, just out of curiosity. But a lot of the research I did, one main area of research we had was supplement work. The other was body composition assessment. So, I did, you name it, in the lab, skin folds, underwater weighing, DEXA, bod pod, BIS, BIA. I mean, we had the whole thing. And a lot of times we would measure with multiple and kind of compare how well they do against one another. So I did the DEXA knowing full well the type of error that I should expect from it. But I mean, it was kind of silly, to be honest. I mean, even though it is a very, very good option, it still said that I was like 6% body fat when I was only maybe 2/3 of the way through prep. I mean, I still had I lost like 15 extra pounds after it said I was 6% body fat. And that's as a person who competes natural at like 5'6", 5'7", right? So 15 pounds is not an insignificant amount of weight at my body size. So yeah, I mean, even with DEXA, you're not going to get individual organ masses, and you're going to have a pretty considerable error rate as well.
Yeah.
I mean, for a little anecdote, like I said, it's hard to study bodybuilders. I can say as a bodybuilder, and I'm sure you can relate, some nerd in a lab coat says they want to mess around with everything you're doing 7 days before a show. The answer is absolutely not, right? You don't want people to mess around with how you're doing your peak week. You're not going to hand over any of those decisions. So it has to be observational in nature. But usually for shows, you're traveling in. You're only going to be in town for a day or two, right? And so then it's like, well, how could we even try to do a study where we're taking multiple measurements over time, right? And I mean, yeah, for me to do a study, I was based in Chapel Hill. I wanted to study bodybuilders. I kept trying and trying and trying to recruit in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Turns out it's not a bodybuilding hub. Who knew? So I had to go down to Tampa. I had to fly to Tampa with my equipment. And good luck going through security with a BIS machine that has all these red and blue and green wires sticking out. They're like, what the hell is that? So I go down to Tampa. Very, very lucky to collaborate with some colleagues there. And still, it was a crazy process trying to do it. And you can't do anything too invasive. So we're doing body composition with ultrasound. And half of these folks, because the time windows are so narrow, they're coming in. They've already got their first coat of their tanner on.
Oh,
And I'm doing ultrasound, and that. I mean, you're using a water soluble ultrasound gel, and tans are getting smeared, and it's logistically a hell of a time to try to do bodybuilding research. And I fortunately going into it had done bodybuilding before I tried to do bodybuilding research. For anyone else, I don't even know how it would be doable, honestly.
can you imagine? Yeah, someone who's never competed before walking into that blindly, like trying to maneuver. Like you even had some idea and it was still challenging. Like someone who does no idea what's going on, they're like, yeah, it's no problem. You're fine. Just get on the table, do the thing. And this person's like, depleted and like exhausted and irritable. Yeah, I can imagine that's just really challenging.
Yeah, and I mean it was just so different. It was so different. I mean, I had a couple people from my lab to help out. I think one person from my lab also came down to help out because I mean, we had to be really mindful of costs, right? So I think I could only go down with one other person, and they were not a bodybuilder, and they were like, "What world have we walked into? Like this is so." Yeah, they were just like it was like just such a culture shock of like what is happening here. And I mean, yeah, like normally when we do body comp assessments, we're working with people who are there's kind of always a theme of being really, really respectful of like, if you're comfortable, could you lift your shorts so that we could access this spot on like the middle of your thigh, right? And we're like lower quad, nothing too crazy. But the bodybuilders, we're just like, seriously, you can put your shirt on. We don't need you to have your shirt on. It was just such a culture shock from going from a kind of conventional body composition lab and then getting in there to measure bodybuilders.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that I mean I've seen as I've become more into the research and looking into various researchers, I've been familiarized with some people who are actually doing a lot of work with bodybuilders. I think I had Guillermo Escalante on, and I mean some of his colleagues that he interacts with a lot, like Chris Bearcat and a few other people, are actually working a lot with bodybuilders. Do you think that? I mean, I can't imagine there's a whole lot of funding particular for body composition and specifically for bodybuilding. I guess what was my question around that? I mean, obviously it's very challenging. And I mean, you work with a research review and probably conduct research more around that. But I guess where do you see that field in like 10 years? If I know that's kind of not a great question, but if you could maybe
No, I think it is a good question. And yeah, I saw that you had Guillermo on the show, and you mentioned Chris. They are absolutely fantastic. I was just literally yesterday reading their review paper about body recomposition. And if people haven't read that yet, it's an excellent, excellent read. I think Guillermo and Chris are both authors on that paper. They're doing terrific work. We reviewed one of their studies in the Mass Research Review a few months ago. Dr. Helms reviewed it. I'm really happy that they're in the field. And actually, Guillermo headed up a certification course with NASM, NASM. Yeah, and so I was really excited. I contributed the cardio chapter to that.
Oh, awesome.
But Guillermo did a remarkable job putting that together. So, your question about where do we go from here? Like you said, there's not a lot of funding, not a lot at all, but there are some questions that can be answered without a tremendous amount of funding. I think it is feasible to do a small bodybuilding study for $15,000, which is not a small amount of money, but it is a doable amount of money if you're doing, crowdfunding, or if you get a big bodybuilding company that can sponsor half of the study or whatever the case may be. So, we're not talking about like, when you're like bringing a new pharmaceutical to market and you're like, okay, where are we going to find $30 million, right? We're talking about more 15 grand, not 30 million. So that's good. In terms of where we're at with the bodybuilding research, I am very optimistic about the future. I mean, if you look back, sometimes I'll tell people who just got into this over the last few years, I'll say, go look at the bodybuilding research before 2012. Not much. I mean, it kind of almost caught on in the late 80s, early 90s. There were a few people who did a few projects in bodybuilding. It almost kind of got over that threshold, got over the hump where it was really going to get some momentum. And then it just died down, and there really was not a ton. And I don't mean to diminish the work that did occur in the interim period, but it looked like it was getting some momentum, and then it really trailed off. I hope, and I also think that we are over that hump, and there's enough momentum now that I do think it'll be sustained. If you look at the strides that have been made in bodybuilding research over the last 9 years, like 2013 to present, it's been considerable. We've answered a lot of questions. We've got a lot of great detailed observations, and I think that this area of research is going to continue to grow. And there are more and more people in the research field right now who are hobbyists who just really like bodybuilding. And so I think the likelihood that it kind of, does that same thing where it just kind of fizzles out and then just kind of stays stagnant for another 15 years, I don't think that's going to happen again. I think we're really doing it now, and it's got enough momentum that it'll continue to snowball. So yeah, I think the research area will continue to grow, but I think people need to be very, very patient because, like I said, there's no large pools of money that are funding this. And what that means is we're going to have to kind of stitch together our understanding and answer questions with these just little projects. One case study here, a group of 7 people there. I mean, it's going to be these tiny, tiny studies where we have to really put them together in order to make, robust, generalizable inferences. But more people are doing it, and the people that are in this space right now, I feel really fortunate to have collaborated with some of these folks because they're very smart, very, very talented, and they're very good people. And I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think I've seen a lot, and this is, I was total bro bodybuilder before I got into the research and using more evidence to instruct my training and coaching and all that. And I think what did it for me was seeing a lot of these practitioners, people who are in the research but are also practicing a lot of these things that we see in the research. Like that to me was really cool. A lot of really jacked people, maybe they're not Ronnie Coleman, but like for me, I was like, okay, there's something here. And a lot of those people, the way they talk, their passions about lifting and all that stuff, is really what drew me to it. I mean, I think, Brad Schoenfeld, Eric Helms, I think you and Greg are also those people. I think everybody, they have this passion, you know what I mean, for lifting or for nutrition or whatever it may be. And that really was what attracted it to me initially.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, I mean, you said that you were a bro bodybuilder, started embracing these things. I was too. I mean, like I said, I didn't have a good grasp on the literature when I was 12 and got into this stuff, right? So, and I think what's really important is like some folks in the evidence-based fitness world, they kind of look down their nose at people who implement some of the kind of more bro bodybuilding tendencies. And ultimately, when you transition from being solely focused on the kind of bro science approach to bodybuilding or lifting, and you start incorporating more evidence-based stuff, it's just that. It's an incorporation of new things. It's not, sometimes people act like you have to forget everything you know and fully move over to a different paradigm. And I think that'd be a shame to forget everything that you know. I think you should question what you know and start rigorously comparing it to what we're seeing in these more robust sources of information. But I always tell people, don't forget everything you know, because what you've done over if you've been bodybuilding for 15 years before you say, hey, what's going on over there on PubMed? You've probably learned a great deal over those 15 years. And there's a good chance that a large percentage of that is going to stand the test of time and will kind of fit its way into some of these more evidence-based strategies. So, yeah, I mean, I always believe that, if we kind of put it in groups and we say there's this kind of like bro set of strategies and ideas with bodybuilding, and then this evidence-based set, I think ultimately when you're able to kind of work between those two worlds and integrate the best of both types of information, to me, that's the sweet spot. Is, the fact that you cannot go on PubMed right now and say, give me the perfect individualized contest prep, enter, right? There is no paper that's going to pop up there. You do have to lean a little bit on experience. You have to lean on other sources of information to fill in the gaps. And hopefully, some of the research coming out is informing those practices to some extent. But, it's really critical that people remember that these studies are part of the puzzle, but they're not necessarily the entirety. Now, someday, with 100,000 more years of research, yeah, we'll have filled in most of the gaps. But for now, it's an incomplete literature, and you do need to lean on some degree of practical expertise to fill that in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be challenging for people because it's not on, we are definitely, as humans, we like to identify in groups, right? And so, for me, I kind of had to separate myself from that when I was, producing content around this, right? I have friends who are bodybuilders. I have friends who are, conducting research, right? And it can be challenging, I think, for people to not try to identify with a certain group. Like, hey, I'm a bodybuilder. I'm especially in the enhanced side, like, I only do these things, and I'm, an evidence-based practitioner. I only do these things. Like you said, I think it needs to be integrated. And I think that's, having conversations and being welcoming to other ideals is probably a big part of that, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, like I said, I got into training at 12, but I got into coaching at 18. Because like I knew I was crazy about this stuff. So I was 18 years old and I was coaching a team of wrestlers, and I was coaching a team of football players at the high school level. And of course, you start out volunteering, work your way up, and all that stuff. But man, I just remember having those experiences. When you walk into a room and say, I'm running the workout today, and there's 96 kids in the room, right? And you get to watch those 96 kids make an entire summer worth of gains, you get a even better appreciation of like, maybe there isn't just one answer for everyone here. You start to see how different people respond to different things, and you contextualize that and say, if all I did was concern myself with the group average within this room, would that really be enough information, to fully encapsulate what happened here this summer? And of course, the answer is no, right? So I think having the practical experience helps you understand, knowing the average effect in that group of 96 kids would be very helpful for the next kid that comes in the door. But I still have to keep my eyes open and individualize based on how that's going. I think sometimes the folks who are a little bit too overconfident in the research findings, I often find that they lack a little bit of that real world experience of just watching enough people train for enough months and start to kind of get that understanding of how much things can vary from person to person. And, to this day, I think my biggest claim to fame that I'm most proud of is my first season that I actually really had control of our wrestling team's off-season workouts. Like, I was an assistant for a while. They said, Eric, you got it this summer. You do your thing. I got on a message board, like a forum, when they did their first tournament of the year. And I was nervous, how are they going to do this year? First big tournament. And one of the first comments was, what the hell is in the water over on that side of town? They were talking about our team, and I was like, you know what? I don't care if we take last place. My guys are huge, and that's all that matters. So yeah, I mean, strength coaching is just it's a great way to throw yourself in there and just say, instead of working with one client at a time, say, hey, I got to get 35 people jacked, and you start to really get an appreciation for those differences from person to person.
Yeah, yeah, that's huge. That's a really really cool um, accomplishment that you were able to achieve by helping all those people. Sorry, I think my fire alarm just got set off, so it's kind of distracting me. I don't know if you heard
Uh-oh.
that.
No,
um,
I don't hear anything at all.
okay, well, good mic then. Uh, yeah, before you leave, I know you mentioned the road to enlightenment on a few of your Stronger by Science podcast episodes, and something that you mentioned that really resonated with me was that you don't put out negativity, like you don't contribute to people on the internet, like you don't engage in discourse, and it's something that I myself also do as far as putting out content. Like I try not to, if I can't contribute in a positive way, then I don't. I was just curious some other things that you've um, come across, some other values maybe when studying and looking into Buddhism that or maybe eye openers or things that you maybe change your value system by looking into this practice.
That's a great question. And to be clear, unfortunately, I must admit, that statement, oh, I only put out positivity, that's an aspirational statement.
Right.
It's something I definitely aspire to. Do I slip up from time to time? Sure. Sometimes I do get kind of dragged into an online argument and things get a little bit contentious sometimes. Hope it doesn't happen often, and usually I'm able to say, okay, I think this person wants to kind of argue and maybe you know, isn't really interested in a really constructive, positive conversation here. But
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so I mean, certainly I don't like go out and do entire like content strategies where I'm just bashing people or calling people out or anything like that. I try to be as kind as I can. I still get grumpy, from time to time, which I wish I didn't. But I've been getting better about it for sure. But absolutely, yeah. The road to enlightenment was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek segment because Greg was doing like a tongue-in-cheek road to the stage. He was losing
Right.
some weight. And so I framed it as like I'm gonna, attain enlightenment in just record time, like kind of jokingly make it competitive, which is, of course, like one of the key tenets of Buddhism is aimlessness. And so, like to make it a competitive endeavor is in and of itself a bit humorous. But yeah, I think the two things that really have jumped out to me. Number one is that very same thing, aimlessness. Um, Aimlessness within the Buddhist. And just to be clear, the type of Buddhism I'm really locked into right now is the Vietnamese approach to Zen Buddhism. So Thich Nhat Hanh is kind of the most known for in that particular school of Buddhism. I read his books constantly, but aimlessness is really, I lived my life for decades just going from accomplishment to accomplishment, just trying to build like a resume of achievements. And the concept of aimlessness is to kind of break out of that idea that you always have to be, pushing like crazy to the next accomplishment for its own sake. It doesn't mean you can't have goals. Of course you should have goals. You should want to accomplish things. We only have one life and we should want to make the most of it. But the problem is when you get too fixated on that next goal, and usually what you find when you dig into that is there's one of two things going into that. One is your ego is out of control and you're just really desperate for everyone to have to admit you're better, right? And another thing could be that perhaps perhaps it could be the opposite thing. Maybe you need to work on appreciating yourself more simply for who you are rather than for your own accomplishments. Maybe there's a lack of self-compassion or self-love that can be contributing to that. So aimlessness as a virtuous concept to me has been really, really a game changer. The other one I would say, let's see, I had one in my head and it vanished when I got all caught up on aimlessness. But yeah, I mean, there's aimlessness has been big. Oh yeah, number two is definitely losing attachment to the ego. So back in the day, I might come on a podcast like this and want to present myself and well, let me try to see if I can sneak in a way to talk about my accomplishments and make it seem natural. Just try to make myself look as good and as accomplished as possible. And when you get so attached to your ego like that, it can be a really detrimental thing, and it can get between the ability to just have a nice conversation and connect and relax and hopefully say some things that people think are interesting and helpful. So I think the two biggest things, yeah, are detaching from that constant, goal striving that just takes your life over and consumes it, and also, um, yeah, just trying to get away from the ego and being so connected and attached to it. Because that's the other thing, like the reason that that's been such a big emphasis for me is because I put a lot of content out into the world. And what I notice is those times when I would still get grumpy and get almost into that negative realm, it's when people were criticizing my content. And I would go in and, be really defensive about it. And
Right.
at the end of the day, I did a lot of reflection. I said, what are you actually defending here? It's not the article, it's your ego,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and so what I found was it's not just that I was like breaking a rule. Like that's really not what it's all about with this road to enlightenment thing and studying Buddhism. It's about learning more about yourself. It's not about following a set of rules because you're supposed to. And so what I found was, through the Buddhist teachings I was reading, I found, oh, when I get really grumpy and agitated and I act like a jerk sometimes in these arguments on the internet, and then I feel bad about it, all that stuff is just me being way too obsessed with my ego and defending this paper as if it's an extension of my self-worth. So yeah, those are the two things that jump out.
Those are really, really huge. That's really cool. I think being in that content creation space, that was something that I didn't create a lot of content for a while because one, I was afraid of being wrong, which probably relates
Mhm.
back to my ego, right? And two, worried that someone might say something, and worried about what people think about me, my appearance, your voice, whatever it may be, and becoming more comfortable with myself, and maybe detaching from my ego, but really, really realizing that it's okay if you were to be wrong, and having these conversations with myself were things that helped me a lot. So I think those are really, really cool, and I think a lot of people could learn from those, at least those two values or concepts from uh, the Buddhism. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
so just to leave off, we'll get you out of here. But I know you offer a few services, and I've been a consumer of a lot of these services because I think they're awesome, and I'd like my audience to be aware of them as well. So Mass Research Review is a research review that you do with. There's probably a number of people I know: Greg Nuckols, Eric Helms, Mike Zordos just recently joined as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yourself.
I'm actually the new guy. Yeah, so
Oh,
the
really?
core team from the original trio was Greg Nuckols, Eric Helms, Mike Zordos. They were doing their thing.
Mhm.
Eventually, I came on board, and right now that's the core team. Sometimes we do have guest articles, and we prefer to take guest articles from people who are writing articles about topics that they do research on. So we don't just kind of grab any person who wants to write and say, yeah, what's your favorite topic? We try to get articles from people who are doing research on that thing, so that it's a really high level of expertise. So yeah, that's the Mass team. We do our research review every month, and I'm not gonna lie, it's a grind. It is a grind for sure, but it's really rewarding, and I have found that I have learned so much from doing a research review because you're not allowed to disconnect from the research. Like
Yeah,
not to be snarky, but there are some fitness pros where if you look at their content, it's like, dude, you stopped looking at the research like 7 years ago. Like now you're just kind of going back to the hits, playing the classics.
yeah,
But yeah, man, I've changed my opinion on so many things in the last
yeah.
couple years because of the research review.
What a way to learn. I feel like if you have to write about something, and really dig into the research, I'm sure you've learned so much from doing that.
Yeah, I review 6 studies every single month. And that
Wow.
would be if I never, I mean, we do a podcast every week at Stronger by Science. So like if Stronger by Science didn't exist and all I was doing was the research review, I would be reviewing 6 new studies in depth every single month. And yeah, I mean, it's it's crazy. It's a grind, but like my advice to someone who's just like really hungry to get into this field and dig in and just dive into the deep end is like just do your own research review. Like hold yourself accountable to reviewing on your
Mhm.
own, even if you don't even do anything with it. Make yourself review like 3 studies a month to start out with, and like you'd be amazed how much if you just force yourself to summarize it, write it in a journal,
Yeah,
like in your diary, right?
in your own words,
Um,
kind of.
yeah, it's just crazy how much you kind of absorb just from throwing yourself in the deep end.
Yeah, and what that product does is it really it provides kind of these summaries and practical takeaways from the research, which so there are people and like myself, it was a great introduction into the research, but I didn't really understand a lot of these concepts. I've since learned a little bit about statistics. I've learned a little bit about the different methodologies and things like that. And a lot of it I've learned through mass research reviews. So I think if you haven't, if you want to get more into the research, you want to get some more practical takeaways. You hear about this new study. You guys are pretty on top of it. I feel like you get some of those newer research, meta-analyses or different research, different papers that come out, and I feel like I see them in mass when it's published. I'm like, oh, it's awesome, and there's some practicality to it. This is what you can take away. This is what we want to see. So if you haven't checked that out, it's 100%, if you're a coach, especially, worth the money. And MacroFactor is something that I used recently too. Could you just briefly talk about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So, like I said, when I was working on my PhD, one of the things that I published about and was constantly thinking about was like metabolic adaptation and the way that energy expenditure changes when we overfeed, when we underfeed, when we do a maintenance phase. I mean, just watching energy expenditure changes across these different contexts. And we teamed up with some really tremendous developers. I mean, our development team, they are like magicians, but Greg and I teamed up with them. Uh, and Lindsay, does our marketing and a lot of our business stuff. But it's a small but really tight team of folks. We made the MacroFactor diet app, and what it does is it has built-in coaching functionality so that you basically tell it, yeah, I'd like to do a bulking phase. I want to gain this many pounds a month. You can, do it by week or whatever, but you tell it your rate of weight gain, what your goal is. And you tell it, I prefer moderate protein, high protein, extra high, low, there's all these different customizable things, but it basically will continue to update your macro and calorie targets on a week to week basis. And it is constantly assessing your energy expenditure day to day, and every single week it updates your targets just like a coach would. And it can't replace every aspect of coaching because hopefully your coach does more than just give you 3 macros and go away for a week, right? When it comes to actual like personal support, behavioral modification, one-on-one consultation, hard to replace that with an app. But when it comes to keeping you on track with a particular goal, whether it's weight gain, weight loss, weight maintenance, telling you, what kind of macros you ought to be looking for, fitting it to your preferences. You can select anything from a high carb diet all the way down to keto. You can do uh, another thing that the app does is, aside from coaching you to a particular goal, it's a very, very efficient food logger. It's got some really innovative approaches to food logging in terms of the actual efficiency of the steps, the number of clicks. And so it's what's really cool about it is the flexibility. It's so efficient to log food. You can do fasting days if you're into that kind of thing without messing up the algorithm. The algorithm can take that information in stride. You can do time restricted feeding because instead of doing, meals that are like bucketed, it's actually a food timeline. So you can get insights about the timing of when you're eating. And the craziest thing to me is we've got a feature where it does speech to text. And so you can literally open it up, say you want to log a food, press the microphone button, and say multiple foods at once with their quantities. So you can
Yeah.
say 6 ounces of chicken breast with 1 large sweet potato and 2 cups of broccoli. It will translate from your voice into text with the quantities and say, do you want to log these 3 food items? And you can adjust the quantities if it misheard you. I mean, I can brag about it because I'm not the developer. I didn't write the code to make that work. But man,
Yeah.
if you're on the market for a really efficient food logger, I obviously would highly recommend it. And then, of course, it's got the coaching functionality. But I know a lot of people listening to your podcast are going to say, but I like to do my own thing. I don't want it to coach me through. We have actually three different tiers. So you can do a totally manual program where it still gives you all the insights about your energy expenditure and all the analytics, but you
Right.
can choose your own macros and calories. You can do a totally coach plan. And we have something called collaborative that's a kind of in the middle. It's like a coach program with a little bit more flexibility for manual adjustments.
Yeah, even if you're just looking for a data collection tool, I think it's a great tool. And then as far as the food, you guys use verified inputs, right? Like through some sort of database, correct?
Yeah, we use totally verified food databases that we kind of draw from, and so you don't run into that thing. I know some of the bigger apps like people will say like, oh well, this app has like 70 million foods in their database, and yeah, and 40 million of them are wrong. So like
Right, right.
you have to like go through the process of sorting through them. So yeah, they're all verified, validated food entries, so you don't have to worry about questioning whether or not the actual information's wrong.
Yeah, no, that's really huge, even for me as a coach, because just trying to make sure my clients are like consuming they have the correct macros to what they're consuming, right? They log certain things, and that can create a lot of error for someone if say like they put in a lot of inputs that aren't verified or just some random user put in.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there, man. Back in the day before we created MacroFactor, I'd be working with one-on-one clients, and I would just say, yeah, use like MyFitnessPal or whatever,
Right.
and they'd say, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on, and I would take a look at their food diary. They give me the access, and I'd say, why does this say that an Oreo has 11 calories? Like that, I don't think that's correct, man.
Right.
Like, yeah, you just go into it and be like, does your ice cream really only have 20 calories or is it more like, 300, and
Yeah.
you find these and that they were logging everything. It's just like the entries
Right.
were total nonsense and they just missed it.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes you can miss it, and even then, like the less experienced dieter, they don't know. They an Oreo might be, they might think it's 20 or 50 calories, right? Yeah. All right. Well, I'll let you get out of here. Thank you, Dr. Trexler, for everything. Was very valuable, and I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. I'll leave all your links down below.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. And I had a fantastic time.
Awesome. You have a great night. Okay.
All right, you too.